Donald Trump's former U.S. National Security Advisor, John Bolton, has been highly critical of the Biden administration's handling of the Gaza crisis. And he also believes his former boss, if he returns to the White House, would ditch NATO with catastrophic consequences. In a week which has seen a dramatic deterioration of relations between the White House and Israel, I can't remember the last time relations were this bad. I wondered what Mr. Bolton made of this when he joined me earlier.
Well, I think they are certainly quite bad, and I attribute it largely to domestic American politics and politics within the Democratic Party, where on the party's left wing and with members of the Muslim American community, there's a lot of disagreement with what started out to be the administration's very pro-Israel policy post-October the 7th in particular. And because in the 7 swing states that will ultimately decide the November election, the results are likely to be very close. Even a relatively modest collapse of the Democratic Party base could be politically fatal to Biden. So he's been trying to walk a tightrope between where I think many of his instincts are and where much of the Democratic Party is pro-Israel, and this more left-wing faction that has a completely different view. And I think that's why he is, in an effort to appease the left-wing point of view, I think he's brought relations with Israel to a very, very difficult point.
And, of course, Mr. Netanyahu is doing absolutely nothing to make his life easier.
Well, I think Netanyahu understands what he thinks Israel's interests are, and that's to eliminate Hamas as a military and political force. And I think he's got the population behind him now. He has just in the past day or so agreed to send a delegation to Washington to talk further, which at least gets communication going again at a very high level. I mean, we'll see what happens in the next couple of days in that regard. But I think Netanyahu's determination to do what the stated objective of the war cabinet, the coalition government is to eliminate Hamas.
Now, you have been warning Americans about the prospect of a second Trump administration, but specifically on the Israel question, how different do you think Trump's Washington would be behaving to Biden's Washington?
Well, I don't think we know because just starting with fundamentals, Trump doesn't have a philosophy. He doesn't do policy in the sense most of us conventionally understand that word. It is anecdotal, transactional, depends on his mood and depends on what he thinks would benefit Donald Trump. Most people, I would say, believe that he will be very pro-Israel because they believe his policies in the first term were pro-Israel, and that's possible, but it's not certain. And looking at what he has said about Israel post-October 7, one is struck by how little he has said. Given an opportunity to be strongly in favor of Israel, he said very little. And what he has said in the past, say, 10 days or so, has been ambiguous. He said, I'm approximating here what he said, but basically Israel should finish this war because its international reputation is being badly damaged. Now, finish the war can mean finish Hamas, or it can mean stop fighting. For Trump to say he's worried about Israel's image really means he's worried about his image, defending Israel if Israel's image is declining. So I think this is, it's not entirely clear to be sure, but it's some indication that's not robust support for Israel, that's for sure.
And what do you think he sees about, what does he think about Israel's actions at the moment? Do you think he's instinctively in favor of Israel going into Rafah and having a final confrontation?
No, I don't. I think his instinct is do what's best for Donald Trump, and I think another potential explanation for his silence is he doesn't know enough about what's going on to come up with a coherent point of view. So, in that circumstance, from his perspective, the less said, the better.
And from your perspective, what would you be advising the Israeli government at the moment as they try to work out what to do? There's 1 million people still stuck on that border. Hamas may well be buried in there somewhere. What should they be doing?
Well, I think the only way that this is going to come out in a circumstance that's really going to provide what's best for the residents of Gaza is for Hamas to be eliminated. I mean, Hamas is who's morally responsible here. They've taken the entire Gazan population and turned it into a human shield. And to say that that should stop Israel's legitimate right of self-defense creates a terrorist veto over that right of self-defense. I think the Israeli people saw...
Even if that means a really, truly horrendous number of civilian deaths, particularly in this last moment when they're stuck against the border with nowhere to go.
Well, I certainly hope not, but who's morally responsible? Who put them in that position? The answer is Hamas after 15 years of uninterrupted rule. Look, the Israelis saw October 7th, in my view, as the second Holocaust, and they're determined it's not going to happen again. And I think they would agree with what Winston Churchill said in World War II with respect to Great Britain. Without victory, there is no survival.
Let me turn to Ukraine, because you've been warning people to believe what Donald Trump says when he says he's prepared to withdraw from NATO. And the question then is, what is the prospect for Ukraine? What's the prospect for the Russian advance if Donald Trump wins the White House at the end of this year?
Well, I'm very worried about what would happen in Ukraine. You know, Trump has said several different things. He said he could solve the Ukraine problem in 24 hours. That, of course, is ridiculous. He said he would get Putin and Zelensky into a room together and they'd solve it that way. I don't think that's going to happen either, whether it's 24 hours or more. That would represent a failure. We know, of course, that would not be Donald Trump's fault, because it's never his fault. So it would have to be the fault of one of the other two of them. And I'm afraid he would look at his buddy Vladimir Putin and agree it's probably Zelensky's fault. So even leaving the NATO issue aside, I'm very worried about the consequences of a Trump presidency for Ukraine.
So does that mean that if the Ukrainians have to consider the prospect of being forced effectively to surrender by the end of the year, the time is now for more munitions, more help for Ukraine to try and put them in as strong a position as possible before that happens?
Yeah, I mean, I do think, I think there's some reason for optimism to think that when the Easter recess is over and the House of Representatives comes back to Washington, that the Ukraine aid will make it to the floor. The speaker's pretty well committed to that. And if it does, it will pass. And they'll figure out a way to pass it through the Senate. So I think for the first time, I'm feeling optimistic that we're within sight of this actually being adopted. And that should hold Ukraine through the end of the year. We'll have to see what's happening. I mean, Russia has been making modest gains, but Ukraine's still been putting ships of the Black Sea at the bottom of the Black Sea. So it's not entirely a desperate situation for Ukraine yet.
And so finally, what would be your message to people in Washington still trying to block this aid, still arguing that Ukraine is not really part of America's essential national interest?
Yeah, I think we need more Republican leaders. I don't think the Democrats have much to say on this score, frankly. I think we need more Republican leaders to say it's in America's national interest here to prevent Russia's unprovoked aggression from succeeding. We're not defending Ukraine because we're nice people, although we are. We're not defending them out of charity. We're defending them because it's in our national interest to do it. Peace and stability in Europe has been in our national interest for a long time, and that includes Ukraine.